Chapter 14 of The Dragon and the Raven by G.A. Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. The Dragon and the Raven by G.A. Henty. Chapter 14. The Repulse of the Norsemen. When within half a mile of the Danish camp, Edmund and Egbert left the band and advanced alone. They were pretty confident that they should find but few of the Danes near the bank of the river, for the arrows from the walls of Paris carried some distance beyond it, and the Northmen consequently encamped some 100 yards away. They had to pick their way carefully, for the ships were moored along the bank, their ropes being fastened to great stakes driven into the ground. There were lights on board the vessels, many of the crews remaining on board. They made their way along until they reached the spot they aimed at. Here lay the 3 sets of vessels, each 6 deep. Their masts had been removed, and the great towers rose high into the darkness above the platforms extending over their decks. The planks forming the gangways up which the towers had been moved had been taken away, save one which gave access to each tier, and Edmund doubted not that it was intended that they should the next morning move across the river in tow of the numerous rowboats. The 2 Saxons did not attempt to go on board, as they had now found out all they wanted, and might mar all by disturbing some sleeper upon the platform. They accordingly returned to the spot where the band were awaiting them. "I propose, Egbert," Edmund said, "that as we go along we cut the mooring ropes of all the vessels. We must do it quietly, so as not to excite any alarm, and they will know nothing of it until they find themselves drifting down the river in a mass. Then there will be great jostling and carrying away of bowsprits and bulwarks, and the confusion and shouting which will arise will tend to confuse the Danes and to distract their attention from us." Egbert agreed to the proposal, and as soon as they reached the first ships the Saxons began their work, sawing with their knives and daggers through the ropes. The vessels lay 4 or 5 deep, and there were many cables to cut, but the keen knives of the Saxons made short work of these. Before beginning their work they had spread along the bank, leaving only 2 men abreast of each ship, so that in the course of 2 or 3 minutes the cables for the length of 40 ships were severed, and these and their consorts beyond them began drifting out into the stream. The Saxons ran quickly on ahead and repeated the work until the whole of the vessels below those forming the platform of the towers were adrift in the stream. But by this time those in the ships at the lower end of the tiers had taken the alarm, and shouts of wonder and anger rose on the air. The 9 Saxons told off for the purpose leaped into 3 small boats and rowed out into the stream, while the rest of the band, divided into 3 parties, dashed across the planks onto the platforms. The Danes here had already been alarmed by the uproar from the vessels adrift, and though unable to see what was passing, judged that something was wrong, and had called to their comrades sleeping in the holds to come up. Some of these, bearing torches, came up on deck just as the Saxons, pouring across the planks which connected the ships with the shore, fell upon them. Taken utterly by surprise, the Danes could offer no effective resistance. The Saxons, charging with levelled spears, drove those above headlong into the water. Then, having made themselves masters of the platforms, they dashed below and dispatched the Danes they found there. The torches were now applied to the contents of the holds. These were for the most part crammed with the booty which the Norsemen had gained at Havre, Rouen, and other places, and the flames speedily shot up. By this time the Danes in the camp, alarmed by the shouting from the drifting ships and the sounds of conflict from the towers, came flocking down in haste. The planks had already been thrown overboard. The Danes strove by pulling at the ropes to haul the vessels nearer to land. Some ran toward their ships, others jumped into boats and pushed out to the platforms and strove to get on board them. But by this time the flames were rising higher through the hatchways. According to previous agreement, Edmund and the leaders of the other 2 parties, seeing that the flames had now a firm hold, cut the ropes which fastened them to the bank, and as soon as the stream began to swing them out, leaped into the boats and rowed for the opposite shore. The uproar was now tremendous, and shouts of rage rose from the Northmen, who were amazed and puzzled by the appearance of the Saxons, whose attire differed but slightly from their own, and the general belief among them was that this sudden alarm was the result of treachery among themselves. There was no time to waste in conjecture. The 3 groups of ships were now masses of flame, in the midst of which the lofty towers rose high. The shouts of the sailors in the vessels, crowded together in helpless confusion in the stream below, rose higher and higher as the blazing vessels drifted down and threatened to overtake them. Some tried to hoist their sails, others got out long oars and strove to sweep their vessels toward the shore, but they were huddled too closely in the stream, the yards and rigging of many having become interlocked with each other. The Northmen leaped into the rowing boats by the bank above where the tower ships had been moored, and rowing down endeavoured to tow them to the bank, but they were now in a blaze from end to end. The heat was so great that it was difficult to approach them, and all endeavours to fasten ropes to them were frustrated, as these were instantly consumed by the fire. The Northmen, finding their efforts unavailing, then turned their attention to trying to tow the ships below to the banks. In some cases they were successful. A few of the vessels also at the lower end of the mass succeeded in getting up their sails and drawing out from their fellows, for the wind was blowing downstream. This, however, proved the destruction of the rest of the ships, for the great towers, rising amid the lofty pillars of flame, acted as sails and bore the fire ships down upon the helpless crowd of vessels. Soon they reached those nearest to them, and the flames, borne forward by the wind, sprang from vessel to vessel. There was no longer any hope of saving a single ship, and the crews, climbing hastily across from one to the other till they reached those nearest to the shore, leaped overboard. Although now more than half a mile below the city, the flames lit up the walls with a bright glare, and the shouts of the exulting Franks rose loud and continuous. The sudden shouting which had broken out among the Danes had alarmed the watchmen, who, ignorant of the cause, called the citizens to arms, and these, on reaching the walls, had stood astonished at the spectacle. The flames were already rising from the three groups of ships which they had regarded with so much anxiety on a previous evening, and by the light they could see the river below covered with a mass of drifting vessels. Then they saw the tower ships float away from the bank, and the figures on their decks leap into three small boats which at once rowed with all speed across the river. That they were friends who had wrought this destruction was certain, and Count Eudes threw open the gate, and with Abbé Eble ran down to meet them. They were astonished when Edmund with his Saxons leaped to land. "What miracle is this?" the count exclaimed. "A simple matter, Sir Count," Edmund answered. "My kinsman and I, seeing that the townspeople were troubled by yonder towers, determined to destroy them. We have succeeded in doing so, and with them I trust fully half of the Danish fleet will perish." "You are the saviour of our town, my brave young Saxon," Count Eudes cried, embracing him. "If Paris is saved, it will be thanks to the valiant deed that you have accomplished this night. But let us to the walls again, where we may the better see whether the Danes can remove their ships from these great furnaces which are bearing down upon them." The sight from the walls, when the fire ships reached the fleet and the flames spread, was grand in the extreme, for in half an hour nigh 300 vessels were in flames. For some time the three towers rose like pillars of fire above the burning mass, then one by one they fell with a crash which could be plainly heard, although they were now nearly a mile away. Paris was wild with joy at the destruction of the towers which had menaced it, and the conflagration of nigh half the Danish fleet, laden with the spoil of northern France. Edmund and his Saxons were conducted in triumph by a shouting crowd to the palace of the archbishop, where Goslin, in the name of the city, returned them the heartiest thanks for the services which they had rendered. The wealthy citizens vied with each other in bestowing costly presents upon them. Bonfires were lighted in the streets until morning. The town gave itself up to revelry and rejoicing. A month elapsed before the Danes recovered from the blow which had been dealt them, and resumed the assault. Part of this time had been spent in manufacturing great shields of bull's hide. These were strongly constructed, and were each capable of covering 6 men. On the 29th of January their preparations were complete, and at daybreak the warders on the wall saw them pouring down into their ships and galleys. As the fleet crossed the river its aspect was singular. The decks were covered by the black shields, above which appeared a forest of spears, sparkling in the morning sunlight. As they reached the shore the Northmen sprang to land, while from the decks of the vessels a storm of missiles flew toward the walls. Vast numbers of catapults, which they had manufactured since their last attack, hurled masses of stone, heavy javelins, and leaden bullets, while thousands of arrows darkened the air. The bells of the church sounded the alarm which called every citizen capable of bearing arms to the walls. The archbishop took his place at the spot most threatened by the enemy, with his nephew, the valiant Abbé, by his side. The Counts Eudes, Robert, Ragenaire, Utton, and Herling stood foremost among the defenders. The Saxons, as before, were held in reserve, but to Edmund and Egbert had been assigned, at their urgent request, the command of the defence of the tower. It was against this point that the Danes again made their most desperate effort. Their main body advanced against it, and smaller parties attacked the city at other points, while the rowing galleys, divided into 2 bodies, strove to destroy the bridge, and so isolate the defenders of the post. Around the tower the combat was desperate. The assailants were well nigh hidden under their great bucklers. Their shouts and the constant clashing of arms which they maintained made a terrific uproar. A storm of missiles from the fleet poured upon the tower, while from the crevices between the shields the bowmen shot incessantly at the defenders. The very number of the Danes hindered their attack, for the tower was so small that comparatively few could approach at once. It had been greatly strengthened since the last assault, and through the loopholes in the walls the archers did their best to answer the storm of missiles poured into the fort. Edmund and Egbert were among them, begging them not to fire at random, but to choose moments when the movements of the assailants opened a space in the roof of shields which covered them. Whenever this took place, a dozen arrows fell true to the mark. Some of those bearing the shield would be struck, and those falling, a gap would be caused through which the arrows of the defenders flew thickly, causing death and confusion until the shield could be raised in its place again. Boiling liquids were poured over those who approached the walls, and huge stones crushed the shields and their bearers. Eudes and his men valiantly defended the wall, and the Danes in vain strove to scale it. All day long the battle continued, but at nightfall the tower still remained in the hands of the defenders, the deep ditch which they had dug round it having prevented the Danes from working at the wall as they had done in the previous assault. When darkness came on, the Danes did not retire, but lay down in the positions they occupied under their shields. In the morning many ships were seen crossing the river again, and the defenders saw to their surprise numbers of captives who had been collected from the surrounding country, troops of oxen, shiploads of branches of trees, trusses of hay and corn, and faggots of vines landed. Their surprise became horror when they saw the captives and the cattle alike slaughtered as they landed. Their bodies were brought forward under cover of the shields and thrown into the moat, in which, too, were cast the hay, the straw, the faggots, and the trees. At the sight of the massacre the archbishop prayed to the Virgin to give him strength, and drawing a bow to its full length, let fly an arrow, which, great as was the distance, flew true to its mark and struck the executioner full in the face. This apparent miracle of the Virgin in their favour reanimated the spirit of the defenders, and a solemn service was instantly held in the church in her honour, and prayers were offered to her to save Lutetia, which was the original name of Paris, and was still cherished by its inhabitants. The Danes were occupied all day at their work of filling up the moat. The besieged were not idle, but laboured at the construction of several mangonels capable of casting huge blocks of stone. In the morning the Danes planted their battering rams one on each side of the tower, and recommenced the assault. The new machines of the defenders did great havoc in their ranks, their heavy stones crashing through the roof of bucklers and crushing those who held them, and for a time the Norsemen desisted from the attack. They now filled 3 of their largest vessels with combustibles, and, placing them on the windward side of the bridge, set them alight. The people of Paris beheld with affright these fire ships bearing down upon the bridge, and old and young burst into tears and cries at the view of the approaching destruction, and, led by the archbishop, all joined in a prayer to Saint Germain, the patron saint of Paris, to protect the city. The exulting Danes replied to the cries of those on the walls with triumphant shouts. Thanks, though, as the Franks believed, to the interposition of Saint Germain, the fire ships struck against the pile of stones from which the beams supporting the bridge in the centre were raised. Eudes and his companions leaped down from the bridge, and with hatchets hewed holes in the sides of the ship at the waterline, and they sank without having effected any damage to the bridge. It was now the turn of the Franks to raise triumphant shouts, while the Danes, disheartened, fell back from the attack, and at night recrossed the river, leaving 2 of their battering rams as tokens of the triumph of the besieged. Paris had now a respite, while the Danes again spread over the countryside, many of them ascending the river in their ships and wasting the country as far as Burgundy. The monastery of Saint Germain, and the church in which the body of the saint was buried, still remained untouched. The bands of Northmen who had invaded England had never hesitated to plunder and destroy the churches and shrines of the Christians, but hitherto some thought of superstition had kept the followers of Siegfroi from assailing the monastery of Saint Germain. One soldier, bolder than the rest, now approached the church with his spear, broke some of the windows. The Abbé d'Aubon, an eyewitness and minute historian of the siege of Paris, states that the impious Dane was at once struck dead. The same fate befell one of his comrades, who mounted to the platform at the top of the church, and in descending fell off and was killed. A third, who entered the church and looked round, lost his sight forever. A fourth, entering it, fell dead, and a fifth, who, more bold than all, tried to break into the tomb of the saint, was killed by a stone which fell upon him. One night, after a continuance of heavy rain, the Seine, being greatly swollen, swept away the centre of the bridge connecting the town with the tower. At daybreak the Northmen, seeing what had taken place, hastened across the river and attacked the tower. The garrison was but a small one, no more than 20 men having slept there. For a time these repulsed every effort of the Danes, but gradually their numbers were lessened, until at last 14 only remained. Their names have come down to us. Besides Edmund and Egbert, there were Hermanfroi, Herivy, Herillard, Odoacer, Herrick, Arnold, Sohi, Gerbert, Elvedon, Habderad, Ermard, and Goswin. These resisted so valiantly that the Danes, after losing large numbers in the vain attempt to storm the walls, brought up a waggon full of grain. This they rolled forward to the gate of the tower and set it on fire. The flames rapidly spread from the gates to the walls, which were all of wood, and soon the whole were a sheet of flames. The little band of defenders retreated on to the end of the bridge, and there, when the flames had sufficiently abated to allow them to pass, the Northmen attacked. Edmund and Egbert were both good swimmers, but this was an accomplishment which but few of the Franks possessed, and none of the remnant of the garrison were able to swim. For a long time the little band repulsed all the efforts of the Danes, but were gradually driven back, foot by foot, until they reached the edge of the chasm. Here they made a last desperate stand, but were at length cut down or driven over by sheer weight of numbers. Egbert and Edmund had disencumbered themselves of all their defensive armour, and at the last moment, throwing off their helmets and relinquishing their spears, they plunged into the stream, diving deeply to avoid the arrows of the Northmen. The fact of the river being in flood, which had caused the destruction of the tower, now proved the cause of their safety. Had the water been clear, the Danes on the bridge above could have marked their progress and poured a storm of arrows upon them as they came to the surface, but its yellow and turbid waters concealed them from sight, and each time they rose to the surface for air they were enabled to take a rapid breath and drive again before their enemies could direct and launch their arrows at them. As they drifted far down the stream they reached the land beyond bowshot of the Danes, and they soon entered the town amid the loud acclamations of the citizens. The Danes now for the most part drew off from the neighbourhood, and Abbe Ebble led out a sortie which reached the Danish camp, and driving back those whom they found within it, set it on fire, and effected their retreat to Paris without loss, in spite of the efforts of the enemy, who rapidly assembled at the sight of the flames. The Danes had brought in from the surrounding country such vast quantities of cattle, sheep, and goats that their camps would not suffice to hold them, and they turned the church of Saint Germain to a stable, and crowded it with these animals. The saint, as the Abbé d'Abon relates, indignant at this desecration, sent a terrible plague among the cattle, and when the Danes in the morning entered the church it contained nothing but carcasses in the last state of decomposition. The valiant defence of Paris had given time for the rest of France to arm, and the Danes scattered over the country now met with a stout resistance. The Northmen were defeated in their efforts to capture Le Mans, Chartres, and other towns, and were defeated in several battles near Chartres by Godroy and Odin. In March, Henry advanced with a strong force to the relief of Paris, and arriving at night attacked the camp of the Danes, slew great numbers, and captured a vast booty, and then, having supplied Paris with a considerable amount of provisions, retired with his band before the Danes had time to assemble in sufficient strength to oppose him. Shortly afterwards the Danes expressed the desire of Sigfroi to hold parley with the Count Eudes. Sigfroi and a number of his warriors landed, and Eudes left the city and advanced to meet them. No sooner had he reached them than he was attacked by the Northmen, but drawing his sword he defended himself with immense bravery until the garrison ran down to his succour, and the Danes were driven back to their ship with loss of nearly half of their party. The Danes now left the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois and surrounded the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, but the monks there paid him 60 pounds of pure silver to leave them in peace. Sigfroi now wished to abandon the siege, which had already cost him so dear, but the Northmen, furious at their losses, determined upon another assault. "Very well," the king said, "have your way then. Attack Paris on all sides, hew down its towers, and make breaches in its walls. For once I will remain a spectator." The Danes crossed the river and landed on the island, but owing to the absence of large numbers on other expeditions, and the heavy losses which they had already suffered, their numbers were no longer so overwhelming, and Count Eudes led out his forces to oppose them outside the walls. This time Edmund headed his band of Saxons, who until now had only taken part as archers in the defence. The combat was a furious one. In spite of the valour of Eudes and Ebble, the Danes pressed hard upon the Franks, and were driving them back towards the gates, when Edmund led his Saxons, in the close phalanx in which they had so often met the Danes in the field, to the front. With irresistible force the wedge burst its way through the ranks of the Danes, bearing all before it with its wedge of spears. Into the gap thus formed, Eudes and Ebble with their bravest men threw themselves, and the Danes, severed in two, were driven back toward their ships. But for some hours the rain had been falling heavily, and the river was rapidly rising, and had already overflowed a portion of the island. Thus the Danes had great difficulty in getting on board their ships again, and great numbers were killed in doing so. There was no longer any resistance to Sigefroid's wishes. A parley was held with the city, and a further sum being added to that contributed by the monks of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the Danes drew off from the town. At this time the long confinement of so many men within the walls had caused a pestilence to break out in Paris. The Archbishop Goslin, the Bishop Everard of Sens, the Prince Hugues, and many others died. The 16th of April was the day on which the Parisians were accustomed to go in solemn procession to the Church of Saint-Germain. The Northmen, knowing this, in mockery filled a wagon with grain and organized a mock procession. The bullocks who drew the chariot suddenly became lame. Numbers of other bullocks were attached, but although goaded by spears their united efforts were unable to drag the wagon an inch, and the Danes were obliged at last to abandon their intention. The same day Saint-Germain is reported to have further shown his power. One of the Northmen, condemned for some offence to be executed, fled to the church for refuge, and was there slain by his countrymen. But all who took part in the deed at once fell dead. The Northmen, struck by these miracles, placed a certain number as guard over the church to prevent any from touching aught that it contained. One of these men, a Dane of great stature, spread his bed in the church and slept there, but to the astonishment of his comrades he was found in the morning to have shrunk to the size of a new-born infant, at which stature he remained for the rest of his life. A miracle of an opposite kind was at the same time performed in the town. A valiant warrior had from the effects of fever fallen into an extreme weakness, and was devoured with grief at the thought that he should no longer be able to take share in the defence of the town. To him Saint-Germain appeared at night and told him that his prayers had been heard, and that his strength should be restored to him. On awakening in the morning he found that he was as vigorous and as robust as ever. Another day, when the soldiers were carrying the banner of the saint round the walls of the town, followed by the citizens chanting hymns, one of the bearers of the holy relics, named Gosbert, was struck by a stone from a catapult. The man who had fired it fell dead, while Gosbert continued his promenade, in no way injured by the blow. The Abbé d'Aubon vouches for these miracles on the part of Saint-Germain in defence of his faithful city. Chapter 15. Friends in Trouble. Although for a time the Northmen abstained from grand assaults, continued skirmishes took place. Sometimes parties landed beneath the walls and strove to carry off the cattle, which the besieged turned out to gather a little fresh food there. Sometimes the citizens, led by Eudes or Ebble, would take a boat and cross and endeavour to cut off small parties of the enemy. They had now sufficient boats at their disposal for expeditions of this kind, for in their last defeat the Danes had in their haste left several boats behind them. Of one of the largest of these Esmond took possession, and going out in her at night, several times succeeded in capturing Danish vessels, sometimes while they were rowing along the river unsuspicious that any foes were near, sometimes by boarding them as they lay alongside the bank. As the vessels so captured were too large to be dragged ashore, and could have been easily recaptured by the Danes, they were, after being emptied of their contents, always burned. The plague continued its ravages, and the city became straitened for provisions. Count Eudes therefore determined to go to King Charles to urge him to hurry to the succour of the town. Almost all the chiefs of the defence had fallen victims to the pest, or had been killed in battle with the Danes, and the count at his departure committed the defence of the city to the Abbé Ebble and to Edmund. He then crossed the stream at night and made his way successfully through the Danes. The Abbé and Edmund vied with each other in keeping up the spirits of the garrison with successful little forays with the Danes, frequently crossing the river to the one bank or the other, sometimes with parties of only 5 or 6 men, and falling upon similar bodies of the enemy. Several times they pounced upon small herds of the enemy's cattle, and driving them into the river directed them in their boats across the stream. In the commencement of July, Eudes appeared on the slopes of Montmartre with 3 battalions of soldiers. The enemy, who were for the most part on the other side of the Seine, crossed the river. A desperate battle ensued. A portion of the garrison crossed in boats to the assistance of their friends, Edmund leading over his band of Saxons. With these he fell upon the rear of the Danes engaged in fighting with the force under the Count, and the Northmen, attacked on both sides, gave way and took to flight. They were hotly pursued by the Franks. The reinforcements entered Paris triumphantly by the bridge, which had long since been repaired. But the siege was not yet over. When the news of the victory of Eudes spread, the Danes again drew together from all parts, and, crossing the river, attacked the city on every side. The onslaught was more furious than any which had preceded it. The Danes had provided themselves with large numbers of mangonels and catapults. Every man capable of bearing arms was upon the walls, but so furious was the attack, so vast the number of assailants, so prodigious were the clouds of missiles which they rained upon the walls, that the besieged almost lost heart. The relics of St. Genevieve were taken round the walls. In several places the Danes had formed breaches in the walls, and although the besieged still struggled, hope had well nigh left them, and abject terror reigned in the city. Women ran about the streets screaming and crying that the end was at hand. The church bells tolled dismally, and the shouts of the exultant Danes rose higher and higher. Again a general cry rose to Saint Germain to come to the aid of the town. Just at this moment Edmund and Egbert, who had till now held the Saxons in reserve, feeling that a desperate effort must be made, formed up their band, and advancing to the principal breach, passed through the ranks of the disheartened Franks, and with levelled pikes charged headlong down into the crowd of Danes. The latter, already exhausted by their efforts, were at once borne back before the serried pikes of their fresh assailants. In vain their chiefs at that point tried to rally them. Nothing could withstand the impetus of the Saxon attack. Astonished at seeing the tide of battle swept away from the breach, the French believed that Saint Germain had wrought a miracle in their favour, and, taking heart, poured out into the rear of the Saxons. The news of the miracle spread rapidly. Through the breaches and from every gate they poured out suddenly upon the Danes, who, struck with consternation at this sudden onslaught by a foe whom they had already regarded as beaten, hesitated and soon took to flight. Vast numbers were cut down before they could reach their vessels. A great portion fled toward the bridge and endeavoured to cross there, but their numbers impeded them, and the Saxons and Franks, falling upon their rear, effected a terrible slaughter. 2 days after the battle a force of 600 Franks arrived from the Emperor Charles. The Danes sought to oppose their entrance to the city, but were defeated with a loss of 3,000 men. The siege was now virtually over, and in a short time the Emperor himself with a great army arrived. It was now November, and after some negotiations the Danes agreed upon the receipt of 700 pounds of silver to retire to Burgundy, and to leave the country at the beginning of March. Having wasted Burgundy, however, they again returned to Paris. Consternation seized the capital when the fleet of the Northmen was seen approaching. A treaty, however, was made, for the wind had fallen just when the Danish fleet, which had but lately arrived and was descending the river, was abreast of Paris. As soon as the wind became favourable, the Northmen broke the truce, slew a number of Franks who had mingled among them, and passed up the Marne. In the meantime Emperor Charles had died, and Count Eudes had been chosen his successor. When the Danes again advanced against Paris, he speedily sent reinforcements. The town had already repulsed an attack. Eudes himself, on St. John's Day, was advancing with 1,000 men-at-arms, when he was attacked by 10,000 mounted Danes and 9,000 footmen. The combat was desperate, but the Franks were victorious. Eudes, however, had other difficulties. Burgundy and Aquitaine revolted, and in order to secure peace to the kingdom he made a treaty with the Danes, giving over to them the province of Normandy. Edmund and Egbert had no part in the second siege of Paris. As soon as the place was relieved by the Emperor Charles they prepared to depart. Taking boats they ascended the river, and to their joy found the Dragon safe in the hiding place where she had been lying for nearly a year. She was brought out into the stream and floated down to Paris, where by the order of Count Eudes she was thoroughly repaired and redecorated. The Franks, convinced that next only to the assistance of Saint Germain they owed the safety of their city to the valour of the Saxons, loaded them with presents, and these, with the gifts which they had previously received after the destruction of the three towers, and the sums for which the booty captured from the Danes had been sold, made up a great treasure. Upon the day before they had arranged to sail, a Danish boat was seen rowing down the stream. It approached the Dragon, and the helmsman asked, "Is this the ship the Dragon, and has it for a captain Edmund the Saxon?" "I am Edmund," he replied, "and this is the Dragon. What would you with me?" "I am sent by the Jarl Siegbert, who lies wounded near, to beg that you will come to him immediately, as he is in sore strait and needs your assistance." "I will come at once," Edmund said. "Put one of your men on board to show me where he is, for I shall be there before you." Edmund's horn sounded the signal, and messengers were sent to the town to order the crew at once to repair on board the Dragon. Edmund landed and took leave of the Frankish leaders. The provisions and stores were hastily carried on board, and then, amidst the enthusiastic cheers of the inhabitants who thronged the walls and the shore, the oars were got out, and the Dragon proceeded at the top of her speed up the river. On the way Edmund questioned the Dane, and found that Siegbert had been wounded in the last assault upon Paris. He had not been present at the first part of the siege, having but recently arrived from Norway. His daughter Freda had accompanied him. Yes, she was still unmarried, although many valiant Northmen had sought her hand, chief among them the brave leader Sweyn of the Left Hand. But there had been a fray on the previous night in Siegbert's camp, and it was said, but for that he could not vouch, that Freda had been carried off. The news filled Edmund with anxiety. Ever since the day he left her on her father's galley his thoughts had turned often to the Danish maiden, and the resolution to carry out his promise and some day seek her again had never for a moment wavered. He had seen many fair young Saxons, and could have chosen a bride where he would among these, for few Saxon girls would have turned a deaf ear to the wooing of one who was at once of high rank, a prime favourite of the king, and regarded by his countrymen as one of the bravest of the Saxon champions. But the dark-haired Freda, who united the fearlessness and independence of a woman with the frankness and gaiety of a child, had won his heart. It was true she was a Dane and a pagan, but her father was his friend, and would, he felt sure, offer no objections on the ground of the enmity of the races. Since Guthorn and his people had embraced Christianity, the enmity between the races, in England at least, was rapidly declining. As to her religion, Edmund doubted not that she would, under his guidance and teaching, soon cast away the blood-stained gods of the Northmen and accept Christianity. In the 5 years of strife and warfare which had elapsed since he saw her, Edmund had often pictured their next meeting. He had not doubted that she would remain true to him. Few as were the words which had been spoken, he knew that when she said, "I will wait for you even till I die," she had meant it, and that she was not one to change. He had even been proposing on his return to England to ask King Alfred to arrange through Guthorn for a safe pass for him to go to Norway. To hear then that she had been carried off from her father's side was a terrible blow, and in his anxiety to arrive at Siegbert's tent, Edmund urged the rowers to their fullest exertions. It was 3 hours after leaving Paris when the Dane pointed to a village at a short distance from the river, and told him that Siegbert was lying there. The Dragon was steered to shore, and Edmund, leaping out, followed the Dane with rapid footsteps to the village. The wounded jarl was lying upon a heap of straw. "Is it really you, Edmund?" he exclaimed as the young Saxon entered. "Glad am I indeed that my messenger did not arrive too late. I heard of you when we first landed, how the Danes, when they sailed up the Seine, had seen a Saxon galley of strange shape, which had rowed rapidly up the river, how the galley herself had never again been seen, but how a young Saxon with his band had performed wonders in the defence of Paris, and had burned well nigh half the Danish fleet. They said that the leader was named Edmund, for they had heard the name shouted in battle, and especially when he with one other alone escaped from the burning tower and swam the river. So I was sure that it was you. Then a week back my men told me of a strange ship which had passed down the river to Paris, and I doubted not that it was your Dragon, which had been hidden somewhere during the siege. I thought then of sending to tell you that I was lying here wounded, but Freda, who had always been talking of you, suddenly turned coy and said that you might have forgotten us, and if you wanted us you could come to us in Norway." "But where is Freda?" Edmund, who had been listening impatiently, exclaimed. "One of your men told me that she had been carried off. Is it true?" "Alas, it is true," Siegbert replied, "and that is why I sent for you. I have never been good friends with Beorn since the wounding of his son, but after a time the matter blew over. Sweyn, who, though but with one arm, and that the left, has grown into a valiant warrior, is now, Beorn being dead, one of our boldest Vikings, a year since he became a declared suitor for Freda's hand. In this, indeed, he is not alone, seeing that she has grown up one of our fairest maidens, and many other valorous deeds that have been done to win a smile from her, but she has refused all suitors, Sweyn with the others." He took his refusal in bad part, and even ventured to vow she should be his whether she willed it or not. Of course I took the matter up and forbade all further intimacy, and we had not met again till the other day before Paris. We had high words there, but I thought no more of it. A few days afterwards I was struck by a crossbow bolt in the leg. It smashed my knee, and I shall never be able to use my leg again. I died of fever and vexation, but Freda nursed me through it. She had me carried on a litter here to be away from the noise and revelry of the camp. Last night there was a sudden outcry. Some of my men who sprang to arms were smitten down, and the assailants burst in here and tore Freda shrieking away. Their leader was Sweyn of the left hand. As I lay tossing here, mad with the misfortune which ties me to my couch, I thought of you. I said, if any can follow and recapture Freda, it is Edmund. The Danes had for the most part moved away, and there were few who would care to risk a quarrel with Sweyn in a matter which concerned them not closely. But I felt that I could rely upon you, and that you would spare no pains to rescue my child." "That will I not," Edmund explained. "But tell me first what you think are his plans. Which way has he gone, and what force has he with him?" "The band he commands are 6 shiploads, each numbering 50 men. What his plans may be I know not, but many of the Danes, I know, proposed, when the war was finished here, to move east through Burgundy. Some intended to build boats on the banks of the Rhine and sail down on that river. Others intended to journey further and to descend by the Elbe. I know not which course Sweyn may adopt. The country between this and the Rhine swarms with Danes. I do not suppose that Sweyn will join any other party. Having Freda with him, he will prefer keeping apart, but in any case it would not be safe for you to journey with your band, who would assuredly become embroiled with the first party of Danes they met, and even if they be as brave as yourself, they would be defeated by such superior numbers." "You do not think that Sweyn will venture to use violence to force Freda to become his wife?" "I think he will hardly venture upon that," Siegbert said, "however violent and headstrong he may be. To carry off a maiden for a wife is accounted no very evil deed, for the maiden is generally not unwilling, but to force her by violence to become his wife would be a deed so contrary to our usage that it would bring upon him the anger of the whole nation. Knowing Sweyn's disposition, I believe that, were there no other way, he would not hesitate even at this, but might take ship and carry her to some distant land. But he would not do this until all other means failed. He will strive to tire her out, and so bring her in her despair to consent to wed him." Edmund was silent for 3 or 4 minutes. Then he said, "I must consult my kinsman Egbert. I will return and tell you what I propose doing." On leaving the cottage, Edmund found Egbert walking up and down outside, awaiting the result of the interview. He had been present when the Dane had told of Freda's abduction, and knew how sore a blow it was to the young ealdorman, for Edmund had made no secret to him of his intention some day to wed the Danish jarl's daughter. Edmund in a few words related to him the substance of Siegbert's narrative, and ended by saying, "Now, Egbert, what is best to be done?" "'Tis no use asking me, Edmund. You know well enough that it is you that always decides, and I agree. I have a hand to strike, but no head to plan. Tell me only what you wish, and you may be sure I will do my best to execute it." "Well, of course we must follow," Edmund said. "Of that there is no question. The only doubt is as to the force we must take. What Siegbert said is true. The Danish bands are so numerous to the east that we should be sure to fall in with some of them, and fight as we might should be destroyed. And yet with a smaller number how could we hope to rescue Freda from Sweyn's hands?" Edmund walked up and down for some time. "I think," he went on at last, "the best plan will be to take a party of but 4 at most. I must choose those who will be willing to pass best as Danes. With so small a number I may traverse the country unobserved. I will take me 2 of Siegbert's men, who, when we get nigh to Sweyn's band, may join with him and tell me how things are going, and how Sweyn treats his captive. If I find he is pushing matters to an extreme, I must make some desperate effort to carry her off. But if, as is more probable, he trusts to time to break her resolution, I shall continue following at a short distance." "Shall I go with you, Edmund?" I think it will be better not, Egbert. Your beard would mark you as a Saxon at once." "But that I can cut off," Egbert said. "It would be a sacrifice truly, but I would do it without hesitation." "Thanks, dear kinsman, but I think it would be of more purpose for you to remain in command of the Dragon. She may meet many foes, and it were best that you were there to fight and direct her. I pray you at once to descend the Seine and sail round the north coast of France. Place the Dragon at the mouth of the Rhine. Do not interfere with any Danish ships that you may see pass out, but keep at a distance. Should Sweyn descend the Rhine, I will, if possible, send a messenger down before him. So do you look out for small boats, and if you see one in which the rower hoists a white flag at the end of his oar, you'll know he's my messenger. If I find Sweyn goes on toward the Elbe, I will also send you word, and you will then move the Dragon to the mouth of that river. Lastly, if you receive no message, but if you mark that in a Danish vessel, when passing you, a white cloth is waved from one of the windows of the cabins in the poop, that will be a signal to you that the vessel is Sweyn's, and that Freda is a captive on board. In that case you will, of course, at once attack it. Let us ask Siegbert. He has sailed up both the Rhine and the Elbe, and he can tell us of some quiet port near the mouth of each river, where you may lay the Dragon somewhat out of sight of passers-by, while you can yet note all ships that go down the river. My messengers will then know where to find you." Having settled this point, they returned to Siegbert, and Edmund told him what he thought of doing. "I can advise no better," Siegbert said. "Assuredly you cannot prevail by force. At present I have only 10 of my followers with me. The rest, after I was wounded, and it was plain that a long time must elapse before I could again lead them in the field, asked me to let them follow some other chief, and as they could not be idle here, I consented. I have 10 men with me, but these would be but a small reinforcement. As you say, your Saxons would be instantly known, and the Northmen have suffered so at their hands during the siege that the first party you met would set upon you." "I will take 2 only of your men," Edmund said. "Choose me 2 who are not known by sight to Sweyn. I wish one to be a subtle fellow, who will act as a spy for me. The other I should choose of commanding stature and the air of a leader. He will go with my party, and should we come upon Danes, he will assume the place of leader, and can answer any questions. There is far too much difference between the Saxon and Danish tongue for me and my men to pass as Danes, if we have many words to say. I shall take 4 of my men, all full grown, strong, and good fighters. They have but little hair upon their chins at present, and they can shave that off. Now, Jarl, I want 5 Danish dresses, for your costume differs somewhat from ours. Have you horses? If not, I must send back to Paris to buy some." "I have plenty to mount you and your party." "Good," Edmund said. "I will go down to my ship and pick my men." In half an hour the party were ready to start. Egbert had received from Siegbert particulars of villages at the mouths of the Rhine and the Elbe, and he promised Edmund that a watch should be kept night and day at the mouth of the Rhine until a messenger arrived. Edmund had already ascertained that Sweyn had left a fortnight before with his following, and had marched towards Champagne. There probably he had halted his main body, returning only with a party of horsemen to carry off Freda. "I would I could go with you," Siegbert groaned as Edmund said adieu to him. "I would ride straight into his camp and challenge him to mortal combat, but as it is, I am helpless." "Never fear, good Siegbert," Edmund said cheerfully. "When your leg is cured, travel straight homeward, and there, I trust, before very long, to place Freda safe and unharmed in your arms. If I come not to you, you will know that I have perished." A minute later, after a few parting words with Egbert, Edmund mounted his horse, and followed by his 6 companions rode off at full speed. He knew that it would be useless making any inquiries about Sweyn and his party, but few of the inhabitants of the country were to be seen about, for the Danes had burned every house within very many miles of Paris, and the peasants would assuredly not have paid any special attention to a party of Danes, for whenever they saw the dreaded marauders, even at a distance, they forsook their homes and fled to the forests. The party therefore rode eastward until nightfall, then picketed their horses, and having lit a fire, made their supper from the store of provisions they had brought with them, and then lay down to sleep for the night. At daybreak they again started and continued their journey until it was necessary to halt to give their horses a rest. They had passed several parties of Danes, for these, in great numbers after the siege of Paris had been given up, were journeying towards Burgundy. There was but slight greeting as they passed, but on one occasion a horseman rode out from one of the bands and entered into conversation with the 2 Danes who rode at the head of the party. They told them that they were followers of the Jarl Siegbert, and were riding to join the rest of his band, who were with the company of Jarl Eric, as Siegbert would be long before he would be able to move, and had therefore kept only a few of his followers with him. "Eric is a long way ahead," the Dane said. "He must be full as far as Nancy by this time. Those who left first," he grumbled, "will have the pick of the country. We were fools to linger so long before Paris." Then turning his horse he rode back to his comrades, and the party continued on their way. They avoided all towns and large Danish encampments on the way, but made inquiries from all small parties they met after the party of Sweyn. They learned without difficulty the place where he had been encamped a few days before, but on their arriving in the neighbourhood they found that the place was deserted, nor could any tell them the direction in which the Northmen had travelled. Chapter 16. Freda. For some days Edmund and his party scoured the country round, journeying now in one direction, now in another, but without hearing aught of Sweyn's party. Certainly they had not gone along the track which the main body of the Danes had followed, but the question was whether they had turned rather to the south, in order to cross the mountain ranges between them and the Rhine, or had turned north and journeyed through the great forest of the Ardennes, and so to some of the other rivers which run down into the North Sea. The latter was in some respects the most likely course to have been chosen. By taking it, Sweyn could avoid altogether the track which the majority of his countrymen were taking, and this would naturally be his object. Siegbert had many powerful friends, and the carrying off of the jarl's daughter from the side of her wounded father would be regarded as a grave offence, and Sweyn might well wish to keep clear of his countrymen until he had forced Freda to become his wife. Even then it would not be safe for him for a long time to return to his country. Striking through the Ardennes he would come down upon the Scheldt, the Moselle, the Maas, or other rivers flowing into the North Sea direct, or into the Rhine. Edmund knew nothing of these rivers, but the Danes with him said they were several rivers so situated, for they had sailed up them. Where they took their rise they knew not, but it would probably be in or beyond the forest of the Ardennes. "Then in that way we will search," Edmund said. "If they come upon a river they will doubtless set to work to build galleys to carry them to the sea, for with only 300 men Sweyn will not venture to march by land through a country which has but lately suffered heavily at the hands of the Danes. It will take him a month or 6 weeks to cut down trees and build his ships, therefore we may hope to find him before he is ready to embark. First we will push through the forest to the other side. There we will question the inhabitants concerning the position of the nearest rivers, then we will divide into parties and go on the search, appointing a place of rendezvous where we may rejoin each other. It can hardly be that we shall fail to find them if they have taken that way." Before entering the forest they obtained a considerable store of provisions, for they had no idea of its extent and had no time to spend in hunting game. The forest of Ardennes was at that time of immense size, extending from Verdun and Metz on the south to Liège and Aix on the north. Men of the present day would have found it impossible to find their way through, but would speedily have been lost in its trackless recesses. But the Saxons and Danes were accustomed to travel in forests, and knew the signs as well as did the redskins and hunters of the American forests. Therefore they felt no hesitation in entering the forest without a guide. The danger which might beset them was of a different kind. Immense numbers of the inhabitants of France, Champagne, and Burgundy had taken refuge in the forests, driving their flocks and herds before them. Here they lived a wild life, hoping that the emperor would ere long clear the country of the invaders. No mercy could be expected if Edmund and his party fell in with a number of these fugitives. They would have no time to tell their story, but would be attacked at once as a party of plundering Danes. Knowing that the horses would be an encumbrance to them in the forest, they were sold to the last party of Northmen they encountered before entering it, and they pursued their way on foot. The greatest caution was observed, every sound was marked, and at the call of a human voice, the low of cattle or the bleating of sheep, they turned their course so as to avoid encounter with the inhabitants of the forest. They lit no fires at night, and scarce a word was spoken on the march. Several times they had to take refuge in thickets when they heard the sound of approaching voices, and it needed all their knowledge of woodcraft to maintain their direction steadily toward the north. At last, after 6 days' journey, they issued out into the open country beyond the forest, and soon arrived at a cottage. The peasant was struck with terror and astonishment at the appearance of 7 Danes, and he could with difficulty be made to understand that their object was neither plunder nor murder, but that they wished only information from him of the situation and direction of the various rivers of the country. After learning from him all that he knew, Edmund arrived at the conclusion that Sweyn would probably attempt to descend either by a branch of the Moselle, and so to the Rhine on the right, or by one of the Maas on the left of the place at which they had emerged from the forest. Edmund decided to strike the Maas, and to follow its course up into the forest, taking with him one of the Danes and 2 of his Saxons, and to send the others to search the banks of the tributary of the Moselle. Before starting, he sent the peasant to the nearest village to purchase garments of the country for the whole party. He had already told the man that they were not Danes, but Saxons, the bitter enemies of the Northmen, and that he had been aiding in the defence of Paris against them. The peasant did not doubt what Edmund told him, for the conduct of his visitors was so opposed to all that he had heard of the doings of the Danes that he well believed they could not belong to that nation. He was away some hours, and returned with the required dresses. Having put these on, and laying aside their helmets and shields, the 2 parties started, the Danes alone carrying with them their former garments. The next day Edmund arrived at the river, and at once followed its course upwards, for Sweyn and his party would be building their ships in the forest. They had not proceeded many miles before they heard the sound of axes. Edmund gave an exclamation of delight. It was almost certain that he had hit upon Sweyn's track, for it was unlikely that any of the inhabitants of the country would have gone so far into the forest for timber. They now moved with the greatest caution, and as they approached the place whence the sound proceeded, Edmund halted the 2 Saxons and bade them conceal themselves. The Dane resumed his own garments and put on his helmet and shield, and then, taking advantage of every clump of undergrowth, and moving with the greatest caution, he and Edmund made their way forward. Presently they came within sight of an animated scene. A large number of trees had been felled by the banks of the river, and 300 Northmen were busily at work. The frames of 2 great galleys had already been set up, and they were now engaged in chopping out planks for their sides. 2 huts were erected in the middle of the clearing. One was large, and Sweyn's banner floated from a spear before it. The other, which stood close by, was much smaller, and Edmund doubted not that this was appropriated to Freda. Nothing more could be done now, their object was so far attained, and retiring they joined the 2 Saxons and made their way along the river bank till they reached the edge of the forest. One of the Saxons was now sent off to the peasant's hut, where he was to remain until the return of the other party, and was then to bring them on to the spot which Edmund had chosen for his encampment. This was in the heart of a large clump of underwood extending down to the river. The brushwood was so thick that it was entered with difficulty, and no passer-by would dream that a party was hidden within it. Near the stream Edmund and his companions, with their swords, soon cleared away a circle, and with the boughs constructed an arbour. A thin screen of bushes separated them from the river, but they could see the water, and none could pass up or down unperceived. The Saxon was charged to bring with him on his return a considerable supply of provisions, for it would have been dangerous to wander in the woods in pursuit of game. The Northmen had, Edmund noticed, some cattle with them, but they would be sure to be hunting in the woods, and as they would wish to save the cattle for provision on their voyage. It was nightfall before the hut was completed, and as they had journeyed far for many days, Edmund determined to postpone an attempt to discover what was passing in Sweyn's camp until the following evening. The day passed quietly, and toward evening Edmund and the Dane started for Sweyn's camp. When they approached it they saw many fires burning, and the shouting and singing of the Norsemen rang through the forest. They waited until the fires burnt down somewhat, and they could see many of the Danes stretching themselves down by them. Then Edmund's companion proceeded to the camp. Anxious as Edmund was himself to learn what was doing, he restrained his impatience, for it was safer that the Northman should go alone. In the dull light of the dying fires his features would be unnoticed, and his tongue would not betray him if spoken to. Siegbert had commended him as a crafty and ready fellow, and Edmund felt that he would be able to gather more information than he could do himself. From his place of concealment he kept his eyes fixed on the Northman's figure. Presently he saw him enter the clearing, and, sauntering slowly across it, throw himself down near a fire by which a party of Danes were still sitting talking. One by one these lay down, and when the last had done so, the Northman rose quietly and stole out again into the forest. When he rejoined Edmund, the latter set forward with him, and not a word was spoken until they were some distance from the camp. Then Edmund stopped. "What have you learned?" Edmund asked, with some curiosity, of course. "All that there is to learn, I think," the Northman replied. "The Lady Freda is, as you supposed, a captive in the little hut. 2 men only keep watch over it by day, but at night 6 lie around it, 2 being always on foot. They speak in admiration of her courage and spirit. She has sworn to Sweyn that she will slay herself if he attempts to use violence to force her to marriage with him, and they doubt not that she will keep her word. However, they believe that she will grow tired out at last when she finds out there is no hope whatever of a rescue. The ships are being built for a long sea voyage, for Sweyn is going to lead them to join the Viking Hasting in the Mediterranean, and has promised his men the plunder of countries 10 times richer than France or England. With so long an expedition in view, they may well think that the Lady Freda's resolution will soon give way, and that she may come to see that the position of the wife of a bold Viking is 1,000 times preferable to that of a captive. Many of the men loudly expressed their wonder why she would refuse the love of so valiant a warrior as Sweyn. The news was at once good and bad. Edmund did not fear Freda's resolution giving way for a long time, but the news that Sweyn intended to carry her upon so distant an expedition troubled him. It was of course possible that he might intercept them with the Dragon at the mouth of the Maas, but it was uncertain whether the ship would arrive at the mouth of the Rhine in time to be brought round before the Northmen descended. The length of her voyage would depend entirely on the wind. Were this favourable when she reached the mouth of the Seine, a week would carry her to her destination. Should it be unfavourable, there was no saying how long the voyage would last. The risk was so great that Edmund determined to make an effort to rouse the country against the Danes, and to fall upon them in their encampment. But the task would, he knew, be a hard one, for the dread of the Danes was so great that only in large towns was any resistance to them ever offered. However, he determined to try, for if the Northmen succeeded in getting to the sea, the pursuit would indeed be a long one, and many weeks and even months might elapse before he could again come up to them. On the following day the rest of the party arrived, and leaving the forest, Edmund proceeded with them through the country, visiting every village and endeavouring to rouse the people to attack the Danes. But the news that the dreaded marauders were so near excited terror only. The assurances of Edmund that there was much rich plunder in their camp, which would become the property of those who destroyed them, excited but a feeble interest. The only point in the narrative which excited their contentment was the news that the Danes were building ships and were going to make their way down to the sea. "In heaven's name let them go," was the cry. "Who would interfere with the flight of a savage beast? If they're going down the river they'll scarcely land to scatter and plunder the country, and he would be mad indeed who would seek them when they are disposed to let us alone." Finding his efforts vain in the country near the forest, Edmund went down the river to the town of Liège, which stood on its banks. When it became known that a band of Northmen was on the upper river, and was likely to pass down, the alarm spread quickly through the town, and a council of the principal inhabitants was summoned. Before these Edmund told his story, and suggested that the fighting men of the town should march up the river and attack the Danes. "It is but a 2 days' march. The Northmen will be unsuspicious of danger, and taken by surprise, and so may be easily defeated." The proposition, however, was received with absolute derision. "You must be mad to propose such a thing, young Saxon, if Saxon indeed you are. But for aught we know you may be a Northman, sent by them to draw us into an ambush. No, we will prepare for their coming. We will man our walls and stand on the defensive, and if there be, as you say, but 300 of them, we can defend ourselves successfully, and we may hope that, seeing our strength, and that we are prepared for their coming, the Northmen will pass by without molesting us. But as for moving outside our walls, it would be worse than folly even to think of such a thing." After this rebuff, Edmund concluded that he could hope for no assistance from the inhabitants of the country, but must depend upon himself and the Dragon alone. He at once despatched 2 of his men, a Dane and a Saxon, with orders to journey as rapidly as possible to the rendezvous, where the Dragon was to be found at the mouth of the Rhine, and to beg Egbert to move round with all speed to the Maas. Having done this, he purchased a small and very fast rowing skiff at Liège, and taking his place in this with his 4 remaining followers, he rowed up the river. It took them 3 days before they reached the edge of the forest. On reaching their former hiding place they landed. The bushes were carefully drawn aside, and the boat hauled up until completely screened from the sight of the river, and Edmund and the Dane at once started for the encampment of the Northmen. They had been 10 days absent, and in that time great progress had been made with the galleys. They looked, indeed, completely finished as they stood high and lofty on the river bank. The planks were all in their places, the long rows of benches for the rowers were fastened in, The poop and the forecastle were finished and decked. A number of long straight poles lay alongside ready to be fashioned into oars, and Edmund thought that in another 2 or 3 days the galleys would be ready for launching. They were long and low in the waist, and were evidently built for great speed. Edmund did not think that they were intended to sail, except perhaps occasionally when the wind was favourable, as an aid to the rowers. Each would carry 150 men, and there were 30 seats, so that 60 would row at once. "They are fine galleys," the Dane whispered. "Sweyn has a good eye for a boat." "Yes," Edmund said, "they look as if they will be very fast. With oars alone they would leave the Dragon behind, but with sails and oars we should overhaul them in a wind. I wish it had been otherwise, for if, when they reach the mouth of the river, there is no wind, they may give the Dragon the slip. Ah, there is Freda." As he spoke, a tall maiden came out from the small hut. The distance was too great for Edmund to distinguish her features, but he doubted not from the style of her garments that it was Siegbert's daughter. There were other women moving about the camp, but the Danes were generally accompanied by their wives on their expeditions. But there was something in the carriage and mien of the figure at the door of the hut which distinguished it from the rest. She did not move far away, but stood watching the men at work on the ships and the scene around. Presently a tall figure strode down from the vessels towards her. "There is Sweyn," Edmund explained, seeing that the warrior possessed but one arm. "Ah, you know him by sight, then?" the Dane said. "I should do so," Edmund answered grimly, "seeing that it was I who smote off that right arm of his. I regret now that I did not strike at his head instead." The Dane looked with admiration and surprise at his leader. He had heard of the fight between the Saxon champion and Sweyn, which had cost the latter his right arm, but until now he had been ignorant of Edmund's identity with Sweyn's conqueror. Freda did not seek to avoid her captor, but remained standing quietly until he approached. For some time they conversed, then she turned and left him and re-entered her hut. Sweyn stood looking after her, and then with an angry stamp of the foot returned to the galleys. "I would give much to be able to warn her that I am present and will follow her until I rescue her from Sweyn," Edmund said. "Once at sea and on her way south she may well despair of escape, and may consent from sheer hopelessness to become his wife. Were it not that her hut is so strongly guarded at night I would try to approach it, but this cannot be done. I must take my chance in the day. Tomorrow I will dress myself in your garments and will hide in the wood as near as I can to the hut. Then if she come out to take the air I will walk boldly out and speak with her. I see no other way of doing it." On the following morning, attired in the Dane's clothes and helmet, Edmund took his place near the edge of the wood. It was not until late in the afternoon that Freda made her appearance. The moment was propitious. Almost all the men were at work on the ships and their oars. The women were cooking the evening meal, and there was no one near Freda, with the exception of the 2 armed Danes who sat on the trunk of a fallen tree on guard a short distance away. Edmund issued boldly from the wood, and, waiting till Freda's steps as she passed backward and forward took her to the farthest point from the guards, he approached her. "Freda," he said, "do not start or betray surprise, for you are watched." At the sound of his voice the girl had paused in her steps, and exclaimed in a low voice, "Edmund!" and then, obeying his words, stood motionless. "I am near you, dear, and will watch over you. I have not strength to carry you away, but my ship will be at the mouth of the river as you pass out. Hang a white cloth from the window of your cabin in the poop as a signal. If we fail to rescue you there we will follow you wheresoever you may go, even to Italy, where I hear you are bound. So keep up a brave heart. I have seen your father, and he has sent me to save you. See, the guards are approaching. I must go." Edmund then made for the forest. "Stop there!" the guards cried. "Who are you, and whence do you come?" Edmund made no answer, but quickening his steps passed among the trees and was soon beyond pursuit. This indeed the Danes did not attempt. They had been surprised at seeing, as they supposed, one of their party addressing Freda, for Sweyn's orders that none should speak with her were precise. He had given this command because he feared that by the promise of rich rewards she might tempt some of his followers to aid her escape. They had therefore risen to interrupt the conversation, but it was not until they approached that it struck them that the Northman's face was unfamiliar to them, and that he was not one of their party. But Edmund had entered the wood before they recovered from their surprise. Their shouts at him to stop brought Sweyn to the spot. "What is it?" "A strange Northman has come out of the wood and spoken to the Lady Freda." Sweyn turned to his captive. She stood pale and trembling, for the shock of the surprise had been a severe one. "Who is this whom you have spoken to?" he asked. Freda did not answer. "I insist upon knowing," Sweyn explained angrily. Freda recovered herself with an effort, and raising her head said, "Your insistence has small effect with me, as you know, Jarl Sweyn. But as there is no reason for concealment, I will tell you. He is a messenger whom my dear father has sent to me to tell me that some day he hopes to rescue me from your hands." Sweyn laughed loudly. "He might have saved himself the trouble. Your good father lies wounded near Paris, and by the time he is able to set out to your rescue we shall be with Hastings on the sunny waters of Italy, and long ere that you will, I hope, have abandoned your obstinate disposition and consented to be my wife." Freda did not answer at once. Now that there was a hope of rescue, however distant, she thought it might be as well to give Sweyn some faint hope that in time she might yield to his wishes. Then she said, "I have told you often, Jarl, that I will never be your wife, and I do not think that I shall ever change my mind. It may be that the sunny skies you speak of may work a wonderful change in me, but that remains to be seen." Sweyn retired well satisfied. Her words were less defiant than any she had hitherto addressed to him. As to the message of her father, who could know nothing of his intention to sail to the Mediterranean, he thought no further of it. 3 days later the galleys were launched, and after a day spent in putting everything in its place, they started on their way down the river. They rowed many miles, and at night moored by the bank. After darkness had fallen, a small boat rowed by at full speed past them. It paid no attention to the summons to stop, enforced though it was by several arrows, but continued its way down the river, and was soon lost in the darkness. Sweyn was much displeased. As they rowed down they had carefully destroyed every boat they found on the river, in order that the news of their coming might not precede them. "The boat must have been hauled up and hidden," he said. "We might as well have stopped and landed at some of the villages and replenished our larder. Now we shall find the small places all deserted, and the cattle driven away from the river. It is an unfortunate mischance." As the Northmen anticipated, they found the villages they passed the next day entirely deserted by their inhabitants, and not a head of cattle was to be seen grazing near the banks. In the afternoon they came to Liège. The gates were shut and the walls bristled with spears. The galleys passed without a stay. Sweyn had other objects in view. Any booty that might be obtained without severe fighting he would have been glad enough to gather in, but with a long sea voyage before him he cared not to burden his galleys, and his principal desire was to obtain a sufficient supply of provisions for the voyage. For several days the galleys proceeded down the river. The villages were all deserted and the towns prepared for defence. When he arrived within a day's journey of the sea he was forced to halt. Half the crews were left in charge of the ships. With the others he led a foray far inland, and after some sharp fighting with the natives succeeded in driving down a number of cattle to the ships and bringing in a store of flour. Edmund had kept ahead of the galleys, stopping at every town and village and warning the people of the approach of the marauders. He reached the mouth of the river 2 days before them, but to his deep disappointment saw that the Dragon had not arrived at the rendezvous. On the following afternoon, however, a distant sail was seen, and as it approached Edmund and his followers gave a shout of joy as they recognized the Dragon, which was using her oars as well as sails, and was approaching at full speed. Edmund leaped into the boat and rowed to meet them, and a shout of welcome arose from the Dragon as the crew recognized their commander. "Are we in time?" Egbert shouted. "Just in time," Edmund replied. "They'll be here tomorrow." Edmund was soon on board, and was astonished at seeing Siegbert standing by the side of his kinsman. "What is the news of Freda?" the jarl asked eagerly. "She is well and keeps up a brave heart," Edmund replied. "She has sworn to kill herself if Sweyn attempts to make her his wife by violence. I have spoken to her and told her that rescue will come. But how is it that you are here?" "After you had left us, your good kinsman Egbert suggested to me that I should take passage in the Dragon. In the first place I should the sooner see my daughter, and in the next it would be perilous work after the Danish army had left for a small party of us to traverse France." "I would have thought of it," Edmund said, "but my mind was so disturbed with the thought of Freda's peril that it had no room for other matters. And how fares it with you?" "Bravely," the Northman replied. "As soon as I sniffed the salt air of the sea my strength seemed to return to me. My wound is well nigh healed, but the joint is stiffened, and my leg will be stiff for the rest of my life. But that matters little. And now tell me all your adventures. We have heard from the messenger you sent how shrewdly you hunted out Sweyn's hiding place."